Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where truth bleeds through the shadows and history's darkest moments are retold with the intensity they deserve. Tonight, we take you back to a day that silenced classrooms, shattered families, and scarred an entire nation. It was a spring morning that began like any other, filled with the hum of lectures and the sound of students rushing across campus. But within hours, that ordinary day transformed into a nightmare of fear, chaos, and irreversible tragedy. This is not just the story of a massacre, it is the haunting echo of 32 lives stolen by one gunman. April 16, 2007 began like any other day on the Virginia Tech campus with the usual sound of sneakers on sidewalks and backpacks bouncing against tired shoulders as students rushed toward their first classes of the week. The crisp spring air carried a sense of routine normalcy. For many, it was just another Monday morning of lectures, assignments, and fleeting conversations in hallways. But underneath that calm surface, a quiet storm was already forming. The students moving between dorms and classrooms had no idea that within hours, the heart of their university would be transformed into one of the most infamous killing grounds in American history. The morning sun peeked through the tall trees surrounding the sprawling campus, throwing soft shadows over hokey stone buildings. Students carried steaming coffee cups and laptops tucked under their arms, laughing at last night's jokes or worrying about the exams ahead. The campus at 7 a.m. was alive but subdued, a place of learning and community. Yet, just a few hundred feet away, in West Ambler Johnston Hall, something unthinkable was about to happen. In a dormitory where young men and women dreamed of futures in engineering, science, and art, the first gunshots shattered the silence. At 7:15 a.m., the sound echoed like thunder down the dormitory hallways. Some thought it was construction noise. Others dismissed it as a door slamming too hard. But it wasn't noise, it was death announcing itself. A young woman and a male resident assistant were the first to fall. Their lives ended instantly in the early morning quiet. The shooter disappeared just as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind confusion, shock, and the first traces of a nightmare no one yet understood. Police were called to the dormitory almost immediately, their vehicles pulling up with flashing lights reflecting against the stone walls. Officers moved quickly inside, their radios buzzing with updates, but what they found was not what they expected. 2 lives had been taken, yet there was no sign of the killer. No suspect waiting, no explanation left behind, just lifeless bodies and hallways heavy with silence. Students living in the dorm peered nervously from their rooms, some dialing family members to say something strange had happened. But the wider campus still carried on as if nothing more than a tragic but isolated incident had taken place. By 8 a.m., the world outside that building remained unaware of what had just happened. Some students whispered rumors of a domestic dispute, others speculated about a jealous boyfriend, but no one could imagine the scale of what was coming. In their minds, the danger had already passed. Locked inside that dormitory with the crime scene tape now stretching across its entrance, professors went about preparing for class, students poured into lecture halls, and the day pressed forward in a fragile state of denial. The killer, however, had not left campus. While law enforcement officers scrambled to secure the dormitory and determine whether they were looking for a fleeing suspect or merely investigating an isolated tragedy, he was already planning his next move. He walked unnoticed through the same campus pathways, blending into the sea of students, carrying within him a chilling resolve. Back in the dorms, the residents who had witnessed the chaos struggled to process what they had seen. Some stood in hallways talking in hushed voices, others huddled in corners with phones pressed against their ears, trying to convince their families they were safe. The news of 2 dead students spread slowly, a ripple of shock that barely reached the surface of the wider university life. But beneath that thin surface, the cracks were beginning to form. Authorities faced an impossible dilemma. Should they lock down the entire campus for what seemed like an isolated double homicide? Or should they allow the nearly 30,000 students to continue with their day? Believing the threat had ended with the first shooting, they chose the latter. It was a decision that would later become one of the most scrutinized in American law enforcement history. At that moment, however, no one could predict what was coming next. As the hours passed, students moved through hallways filled with the scent of chalk and old books. Professors clicked through PowerPoint slides and notebooks filled with scribbles about physics, literature, and history. Life, in its fragile rhythm, continued. The university police and administrators assumed the danger was contained, but in truth, the predator was still among them, watching, waiting, preparing. Inside Norris Hall, an academic building on the other side of campus, classrooms filled with students who had no reason to feel unsafe. Desks were arranged neatly in rows, sunlight poured through windows, and the sound of voices echoed softly off the walls. Some students pulled out their laptops while others absent-mindedly doodled in their notebooks, unaware that they sat in what would soon become the deadliest scene of all. The silence that fell after the first dormitory shooting was not the sound of safety, but of something far more sinister. It was the silence of a calculated pause, a deliberate moment of waiting, as though the shooter wanted the world to believe everything was over. It was the kind of silence that misleads, lures, and disarms, leaving everyone vulnerable to what was coming. The day wore on, and across campus, students walked past police cars, without fully realizing the danger they had been spared only temporarily. Some glanced at the flashing lights and shrugged, assuming the worst was already behind them. The cafeteria buzzed with chatter, the library filled with the soft clicking of keyboards, and lecture halls overflowed with tired students listening half-heartedly to professors. Every corner of the campus lived inside a bubble of false calm. But for the gunman, the morning was only the beginning. The first two victims were merely the opening act of a much darker plan. His face was calm, almost detached, as he moved through the crowds unnoticed, carrying with him the weapons and the intent to cause devastation, unlike anything the university had ever seen. The tragedy that had begun in a dormitory was about to return in a way no one could escape. 2 hours had passed since the first gunshots rang out in West Ambler Johnston Hall, and the campus of Virginia Tech seemed to exhale in collective relief. For most students, life resumed as if the tragedy were contained within that dormitory, an isolated act of violence that police had under control. Lecture halls buzzed with the sound of chalk against blackboards, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the quiet shuffle of pages turning. In the courtyard, students crossed paths without urgency, unaware that a storm was walking among them. The gunman had not fled campus, had not abandoned his plan, but had instead been watching, waiting, moving with deliberate calm toward his chosen destination. Norris Hall stood at the edge of campus, an engineering building with long corridors and heavy doors, a place where minds wrestled with equations and theories. On that morning, the building felt no different than any other day. Professors greeted students at the door, voices lifted with the energy of a new week. Young men and women filled the classrooms with laptops, textbooks, and sleepy eyes still adjusting to the early hour. The only warning they had of what was about to happen came not from a siren or announcement, but from the sound of metal chains clinking in the hallway. The gunman had arrived. With calculated precision, he secured the main doors of Norris Hall, with heavy chains and locks, trapping everyone inside. He had transformed the building into a cage, one from which escape would be nearly impossible. Students in classrooms glanced at each other, confused by the strange noises outside, but before their questions could form into words, the first bullets shattered the air. A professor in the first classroom never had a chance to react. Gunfire erupted in rapid succession, desks splintered, and screams filled the room. Students dove to the floor, clutching their heads, pushing chairs against doors in desperate attempts to create barriers. But the walls of a classroom were no defense against the rage that had just entered. The shooter moved with frightening calm, his face expressionless as he fired round after round. Some students tried to fight back. Others attempted to flee through windows, breaking glass with their bare hands, cutting themselves in desperation. The building's hallways echoed with chaos, the sound of bullets bouncing off walls, footsteps racing, doors slamming, and voices screaming in confusion and terror. Professors shouted for students to get down, urging them toward corners, urging them to stay quiet, even as the gunman moved from one room to the next with ruthless determination. In one classroom, the professor lunged at the door, holding it shut with his own weight as the gunman tried to force his way inside. The students, guided by their teacher's sacrifice, climbed out of the windows one by one, jumping 2 stories to the ground below. Some broke bones, others ran limping across the lawn, but they survived because of his courage. His body remained behind, riddled with bullets, a shield for those who might have never seen daylight again. In another room, the students huddled together under desks, trembling, their breaths shallow and fast. The gunman burst through, spraying bullets across the room in a cold mechanical rhythm. Some students fell instantly, others cried out in pain, clutching wounds, while a few lay as still as possible, pretending to be dead, praying the shooter would not notice them. The floor became slick with blood, the air heavy with smoke and gunpowder, the cries of the injured echoing against the walls. Desperation spread throughout the building. On the second floor, students smashed computers against windows to break them, pushing each other out in frantic attempts to escape. Some landed safely on the grass below, others hit the hard pavement and cried out in pain. But all knew staying inside meant certain death. Those who escaped carried with them the horror of what they had seen, the lifeless faces of classmates, the haunting sound of gunfire still chasing them as they ran. Outside Norris Hall, police began to arrive, unsure of the scale of what was happening inside. They heard the shots, dozens of them, echoing through the halls, each one marking another life in peril. Officers rushed toward the building but were slowed by the chained doors, forced to break through barriers the gunmen had carefully prepared. Time slipped away with each passing second, and inside, the nightmare continued. Students crouched behind overturned desks, clutching one another, whispering prayers as footsteps approached. The sound of magazines being reloaded became as terrifying as the gunfire itself, a reminder that the shooter was far from finished. Each door that opened became another scene of carnage. In some rooms, students tried to hold the door shut with their feet pressed against the floor, but the bullets tore through the wood and walls, striking anyone in their path. Phones buzzed with incoming calls and messages from parents who had heard rumors of a shooting. Some students dared not answer, afraid the sound of a voice would give them away, while others whispered trembling words into their phones, desperate to tell their loved ones goodbye. The gunman moved relentlessly, his path leaving behind silence. Where laughter once filled the air. In one classroom, a young woman whispered to her friend that she couldn't feel her legs. Her friend gripped her hand, refusing to let go, whispering back that help was coming, even though she wasn't sure if it was true. Across the hall, a boy pressed his body against the cold floor, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it would give him away. The shooter stepped over bodies, eyes scanning, hands steady, pulling the trigger again and again, as if nothing around him carried any meaning. Norris Hall had become a place of desperation, a place where students and teachers fought not just to live but to give others a chance to escape. Every locked door bought a few more seconds of life. Every act of bravery, holding a door, throwing a chair, shielding a friend, echoed in the midst of terror. Outside, the sound of police battering at the doors grew louder, but inside, the gunman still had the advantage of time, and time was all he needed to continue his rampage. Panic spread like wildfire across the Virginia Tech campus as word of a shooting inside Norris Hall began to ripple outward. Sirens wailed in the distance, police radios crackled with frantic voices, and helicopters circled above the sprawling university grounds. But for those trapped inside the building, the nightmare had no filter of distance or news reports. It was raw and immediate, a fight for survival against a man who showed no hesitation and no mercy. Every hallway echoed with the deafening sound of gunfire. Every classroom became either a hiding place or a tomb. In one room, students pressed their bodies against the door as bullets tore through it like paper, splinters raining down on them. A professor shouted at his students to climb through the windows, using his own body to block the door as the gunman tried to push through. One by one, students leapt to the ground 2 stories below, some breaking bones, some limping away bleeding from shattered glass, but alive because their teacher refused to move. When the shooter finally forced his way inside, he was met not by terrified students, but by a lone man standing between him and the escapees. The professor never left that classroom alive, but dozens of his students did. Elsewhere, in a classroom filled with fear and silence, students lay flat against the floor, pretending to be lifeless. The gunman entered, his expression chillingly calm as he fired into the huddled bodies. Some cried out despite themselves, unable to hold back the agony of their wounds. One student, struck in the shoulder and bleeding heavily, bit down on his sleeve to keep from screaming, willing himself to stay motionless while the shooter stepped over him. Another young woman, trembling so hard she thought her body would give her away, clutched the hand of her best friend who was already gone. The sound of the shooter reloading was like thunder to their ears, a reminder that the terror would not end until he decided it would. In another corner of Norris Hall, students broke windows with their bare hands, pushing each other through narrow openings. Some climbed out and dangled desperately before dropping to the ground, while others hesitated, too terrified to move. A young man shouted at his classmates to go, promising he would follow, but the moment he turned back toward the room, gunfire erupted again, and he never made it out. Those who landed on the grass below looked up in disbelief, hearing the chaos still raging above them, unable to comprehend how many friends would never make that same jump. The hallways became rivers of blood and silence broken by bursts of screams. The gunman walked them as though they belonged to him alone, moving deliberately from door to door. Each time he reloaded, the metallic click sent chills through those still alive. Students whispered frantic prayers. Others sent text messages to their families with trembling hands, some typing words of love and goodbye. Parents who received those messages frantically called their children back, but many phones went unanswered, lying silent in bloodied pockets. Outside, police officers surrounded the building, struggling to gain entry because of the chains and locks the shooter had secured around the doors. They could hear the endless stream of shots from inside, each one stabbing at their nerves, each one a reminder that every second wasted meant another life lost. Officers tried to break windows, tried to force doors, but every moment of delay allowed the gunman to continue his rampage. SWAT teams prepared to storm the building, but the shooter had already crafted his stage, holding control in those crucial minutes. Inside, stories of courage continued to unfold. A graduate student barricaded himself against a door to buy his students time, absorbing bullets meant for others. Another professor guided students toward windows even as he fell, his last words urging them to keep moving. Some classmates shielded others with their bodies, sacrificing themselves without hesitation. The line between survival and sacrifice blurred in every room, heroes rising not with weapons, but with sheer will to save lives. One student, bleeding from his leg, dragged himself across the floor to pull another classmate toward safety. The shooter passed them by, assuming they were already dead, and in that cruel twist of fate they survived. Another, too injured to move, whispered to those around her not to waste time on her. urging them to escape while they still could. The midst of terror, acts of unimaginable selflessness flickered like faint lights in the darkness. The gunman showed no sign of fatigue or hesitation. He reloaded with calm precision, firing into classrooms with the same cold detachment each time. His face betrayed no emotion. His steps never faltered. It was as though the screams, the chaos, the blood had no meaning to him. As though he had become detached from humanity itself. Meanwhile, outside the chain-locked building, the police finally breached one of the entrances. They stormed inside, their boots pounding against the floor, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands. The echo of gunfire still bounced through the halls, guiding them toward the upper floors. But even as they closed in, those trapped inside had no idea rescue was near. For them the nightmare had no end in sight, only the endless rhythm of gunshots. And the dread that their classroom might be next. Parents gathered outside the campus, their faces pale with terror, clutching phones and waiting for news. Helicopters filmed the chaos from above, broadcasting images to the nation of a university under siege. Students who had escaped ran across lawns, some sobbing, some limping, some covered in blood. Unable to speak through the shock, reporters scrambled for answers, but no one yet understood the scale of what was unfolding. The only certainty was that Norris Hall had become the center of unimaginable tragedy. Inside, the silence between gunshots grew heavier, more suffocating. Students pressed against the floorboards, their ears straining for any sound that might mean the gunman had left, yet the footsteps always returned. One survivor later recalled hearing the click of the gun just inches away from his head, the shooter moving on only because he believed the young man was already gone. Another remembered the faint sound of sirens drawing closer, a fragile thread of hope in the chaos that the massacre continued, stretching every second into an eternity, until at last the sound of approaching officers began to fill the building. The shooter knew they were coming, and the end of his rampage was near. But before the police could reach him, he made a final choice that would deny justice and leave the world with more questions than answers. When the police finally forced their way into Norris Hall, the scenes that confronted them were beyond anything they had prepared for. The hallways were littered with shattered glass, overturned desks, and the echoes of silence that follow unspeakable violence. Blood trailed across the floors, marking the desperate paths of those who had tried to crawl to safety. Classrooms once filled with the ordinary rhythm of lectures and note-taking now stood as crime scenes, each one carrying its own story of terror and sacrifice. The smell of gunpowder lingered heavy in the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of blood, a combination that seared itself into the memories of every officer who entered that day. Inside one room, bodies lay scattered across the floor, desks overturned as though they had been shields against the storm. Some students still clutched notebooks and pens, their final moments frozen in an image of interrupted learning. In another classroom, windows were broken, glass scattered across the ground where survivors had leapt to save themselves, leaving behind friends who never got the chance. Officers moved quickly, searching for signs of life, calling out, kneeling beside the wounded, trying to bring order to chaos. For many it was already too late. The stillness of so many young faces spoke louder than any words could. The gunman himself was found in one of the classrooms, lifeless on the floor, his weapon nearby. He had turned the gun on himself, ending his life before law enforcement could stop him. There would be no trial, no confession, no explanation delivered in his own words. His silence became his final act of control, leaving behind only questions and fragments of a shattered campus. The officers who found him felt a rush of frustration, mixed with relief that the killing was finally over. Frustration that he had stolen accountability along with the lives he had already taken. News spread quickly across the campus and then across the world. 32 students and faculty members had been killed, making it the deadliest school shooting in American history at that time. The numbers felt impossible to comprehend. Parents stood outside police barricades, clutching each other, waiting for names, some breaking down when they realized their children would never walk out of Norris Hall. Survivors staggered into the sunlight with hollow eyes, their clothes stained with the evidence of what they had endured. Some limped, some wept, some collapsed into the arms of strangers, carrying trauma that would last a lifetime. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together a portrait of the gunman. They found a history of mental health struggles, troubling writings, and signs that he had been isolated long before that April morning. Professors had reported his disturbing behavior, students had noticed his withdrawal, yet none of the warnings had added up in time to prevent the massacre. Questions of responsibility filled the air. Could the university have acted differently? Could law enforcement have locked down the campus after the first shooting? Could 32 lives have been spared? These questions haunted not only the families but the entire nation. But no investigation, no report, no public statement could undo what had already been done. The victims were more than names on a list. They were sons and daughters, friends and mentors, people who had dreamed of futures that would never arrive. One was a professor who had survived the Holocaust only to die shielding his students from bullets. Another was a young woman who had just transferred from another university to pursue her passions. Each victim carried a story that ended too soon, and each story became a reminder of the fragility of life in a world where violence can erupt without warning. The campus transformed in the aftermath. Memorials sprung up, flowers and candles covering the grounds, photographs of smiling faces placed carefully among them. Students walked the same paths they had walked that morning, but every step now carried the weight of memory. The sound of laughter was replaced with the sound of sobbing. The quiet conversations of friends turned into collective grief. Vigils were held, voices joined in silence and prayer, trying to find meaning in something that felt utterly meaningless. The tragedy rippled far beyond Virginia Tech. Across America, debates reignited about gun control, mental health, and campus security. News outlets replayed the footage, families told their stories, and survivors struggled to put into words what they had endured. The world watched as a community tried to heal from wounds that could never fully close. The massacre became not only a chapter in history, but a warning of what could happen again if lessons were not learned. For those who lived through that morning, the memories never faded. The sound of gunfire echoing through hallways, the sight of classmates falling beside them, the feeling of helplessness as doors rattled and bullets tore through walls. These moments replayed in their minds long after the news cameras left. Survivors carried scars both visible and invisible, haunted by questions of why they lived when so many others did not. Some found strength in honoring the memories of their friends. Others struggled in silence, each coping in their own way with the weight of survival. Virginia Tech itself vowed to never forget. Monuments were built, scholarships established in the names of the fallen, and the community came together year after year to honor those who had been lost. Yet even with the memorials, the sense of normalcy never fully returned. The campus would always be marked by April 16, 2007, a day when ordinary life was shattered by extraordinary violence. In the end, the story of that day was not only about one gunman but about the 32 lives he stole, the countless lives he scarred, and the nation he shook. It was about the heroes who stood in front of bullets, the students who carried each other out of windows, the professors who used their last breaths to protect their students. It was about a silence that followed the final gunshot, a silence that continues to echo in classrooms, in families, in a country still searching for answers. Because the Virginia Tech massacre was more than a tragedy, it was a reminder of the darkness one person can unleash, and of the light that others can bring even in the face of that darkness. It left behind grief, questions and wounds that time alone cannot heal. And though the shooter's name may fade into the shadows of infamy, the names of the 32 will remain etched in history, remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Their stories are the legacy of a day that will never be forgotten. A nightmare that ended only when the last shot was fired and silence finally fell over Norris Hall.